Palworld, an open-world adventure that seems to defy all genre norms. The game was released seemingly out of nowhere and managed to capture the hearts of over 8 million players in only the first week of its launch. It now ranks as the second highest player count in Steam history, even surpassing Counter-Strike. But the development of the game wasn't nearly as smooth as its release, and the game almost never saw the light of day. They even hired a part-time convenience store employee to fill one of their most important roles. So how was a small team able to take this big, ambitious vision and turn it into one of the most talked about games on Steam in history? Well, our story begins in Tokyo, Japan, with a Mr. Mizobe, the CEO of Pocket Pair, the creators of Palworld. Mr. Mizobe had never made a game, but he was confident in himself. So he contacted his junior from university and started making fantasy mobile games together. But even after making dozens of prototypes in the search for a fun and innovative game, they eventually scrapped all of them. During this process, Mr. Mizobe met the person who would then become the director of Pocket Pair, and together the team went on to finish their prototype finally. Now that they had this solid prototype, they decided to visit publishers, which in return for funding the development of the game, they would get a cut of the game after its release. Mr. Mizobe persisted and went to 10 different publishers to pitch their games, but they all said no. All the publishers absolutely loved the gameplay, so why did they say no? That's the problem with a lot of companies these days. They have revenue goals to hit and they want a proven way to make money. So Mr. Mizobe realized that if the publishers couldn't see the potential of his game, then he would have to prove it for himself. Always making sure to keep fun the main priority. But the decision to self-fund the game was only the beginning of his long and tumultuous journey. Tumultuous? Is that a word? It was then where they started to focus work on their first true commercial game, {Overdungeon}. The game was built in the Unity engine and was mostly using existing assets, so existing art, existing music. It took only about half a year to complete the game, and they released it on Steam in 2019. And to their surprise, it did relatively well. It sold over 100,000 copies, which for a first commercial game, that's pretty out of the ordinary. Pumped up, they decided to work on their second title called Craftopia. This was a much more ambitious game. It was open world. It took inspiration from his previous game, Risk of Rain, and from the now popular Battle Royales. He had also wanted to include some sort of automation like in Factorio, because he found the process of collecting materials and crafting very tedious in most games. But during the development of the game, he realized something. He didn't need to conform to what popular games were doing to make it be fun. So he decided to wing it and just put a bunch of stuff together and throw out what didn't work, which is not how game companies do things at all. And this kind of thinking was also in line with Palworld's development. But it just goes to show that sometimes you don't need to conform to all the rules, because when the game launched, it sold over 600,000 copies on Steam. So the company was hyped, Mr. Mizobe was hyped, and he realized that as long as the game was fun, people would buy it, and you didn't really need to conform to all of these standards and IPs and all of these shenanigans that the real life supposedly wanted. He gained a lot of knowledge and connections, which would eventually pave the way for the development of Palworld. In his own words, without {Overdungeon}, Craftopia would not have been born. And without Craftopia, Palworld would not have been born. But how was Mr. Mizobe able to go from a small team developing Craftopia that heavily relied on existing assets to assembling a whole company with over 40 employees and over the next 3 years crafting 100 unique pals for their open world large adventure game? Well, the development of Palworld could be considered a series of miracles, chaotic ones at that, with carefully placed events and people that Mr. Mizobe met along the way and would eventually help with the success of Palworld. And even without one of them, the game wouldn't have been born today. He even said that the game was the opposite of the proper game development. Let's set some context here. In Japan, for the longest time, the popular game genre was RPGs, or role-playing games. But over the years, FPSs and third-person shooters began to rise with the popularity of battle royales. But it was still new, and as the main element of Palworld is guns, it was hard to find someone with that experience in Japan that would join their small team. So Mr. Mizobe went where anyone else would go to search for talent: Twitter, or X. While searching, he found an unusual account that only posted videos of reloading guns. The tweets were all in English, but he found that the hashtags were in Japanese. He decided to take a risk and DM this person, asking if they had any experience in the industry, hoping to hire him. But Mr. Mizobe was met with immediate confusion as he received a reply right away. He could not believe it. He said, "Are there really people like this in the world?" And he found out that the person was only 20 years old and was working part-time at a convenience store in Hokkaido. He had learned to make the animations and use the tools himself through YouTube tutorials. He had also taught himself English while playing FPS games. He was very dedicated to his craft. Mr. Mizobe sensed his talent and decided to send him a video of an early build of the game to get his feedback. In only 25 minutes, he received a response, and an excellent one at that, oozing with passion and interest. Mr. Mizobe liked this strangeness and passion, and he realized that these are the kind of people that take ideas from 0 to 100 real quick. So the previous convenience store employee now worked part-time for Pocket Pair. The new employee had an immense talent with sound effects and had learned to navigate a game engine all by himself in a super quick time. Mr. Mizobe quickly realized how invaluable he was and offered him a full-time position if he moved to Tokyo. So he was now a full-time employee of Palworld and helping to contribute on the most important parts of the game, which were the gunplay. "I want to be grateful for the miracle that I was able to meet him," Mr. Mizobe says. But the new hire wasn't the only one pivotal success that led to the creation of Palworld. In fact, there were more surprising twists and turns that Mr. Mizobe didn't expect, but ended up being exactly what Palworld needed. Mr. Mizobe had been wearing a lot of hats as the CEO of the small Palworld team, and had been working on making 3D models for the Pals. He soon realized, though, how time-consuming it was to make just one model, as it took him one entire month. He realized the game would never get done because he wanted to have over 100 unique Pals in this world, and each of them would have different skeletons and different shapes. Then each monster would need to be animated. They'd need an idle animation, a moving animation, jumping, attacking, and the list goes on. He calculated that if he worked on one motion per day, it would take him 2,000 days to finish all of the Pals, which is over 5 years. The company would long be bankrupt by this time. But as luck would have it, Mr. Mizobe one day received a call from a human resources company saying they had found a person named Ryohei Adachi. He was a veteran motion designer with a lot of experience, which is just what Palworld needed. He was hired as a contract worker to start, but Mr. Adachi quickly noticed something odd about the 3D models. "Where's the rig?" he asked. A rig in animation is a way to get a skeleton of a 3D model and map it into a system of interconnected bones. And this helps define how the character's bones move or react or bend in certain situations. But Mr. Mizobe had been manually moving each bone for each frame of each animation for the Pals he was working on, which is a non-efficient and time-consuming process, to say the least. That would take forever. He had been aware of the existence of a rig before, but he didn't use it for some reason. And my thought is because since his previous games heavily relied on existing assets, which all that work was already done for him, he never really had to worry about it. All their files had also been a big mess. There were no naming conventions. A lot of the work they had done hadn't been backed up to the cloud, which is vital just in case anything goes wrong. But luckily, Mr. Adachi took over, and despite his hesitation at the large amount of work that had to be done, he was able to work on the animations for the characters, this time with a rig. So far, the company had 2 excellent new hires, one being the expert animator for shooter games and the other being an expert motion designer for the Pals. But they still had 2 vital roles they needed to fill. At this point, Palworld had been in development for 1 to 2 years, and just as they were ramping up, they decided to switch game engines from the Unity game engine to Unreal Engine 4. Now, switching engines is no easy task and can be a huge hit to motivation and is extremely time-consuming. For one, Unreal uses a complete different programming language than in Unity. Unreal uses C++ and Unity uses C#. And C++ is not easy, guys. And also, almost all of the assets that they had purchased in the Unity game engine would be rendered useless when they switched to Unreal. It was also much more difficult to find engineers that had knowledge in Unreal Engine 4. But most importantly, none of the team had any experience with Unreal, so why did they decide to switch all of a sudden? Even Mr. Mizobe himself said, "In modern development, it would be extremely rare for all members to rebuild from scratch with an engine they have no experience with. There is no one who would make such decisions, and at that point, the project would have failed." But Mr. Mizobe one day received an email out of the blue from an experienced engineer named Mr. Matsutani. Mr. Matsutani had a lot of technical experience, enough to be considered a lead engineer, which is something the small company had been lacking. But he only knew how to use Unreal Engine. So Mr. Mizobe was faced with 3 choices. 1. Do not hire Mr. Matsutani. 2. Have Mr. Matsutani learn Unity from scratch. Or 3. Bet on Mr. Matsutani and throw away all of their work to recreate Palworld in Unreal Engine. So Mr. Mizobe went with the 3rd option and decided to take a bet on him and move to Unreal Engine. Mr. Matsutani was in charge of educating the entire team on how to use the engine. They even had to learn a new version control system, which is a way to easily back up projects on the cloud so they can also be shared with everyone on the team. The Palworld team was stepping into uncharted territory, adapting to new tools and workflows. But as they navigated these technical seas, another piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. This next addition to the team would breathe life into the very heart of Palworld itself, its pals. But before we discuss the creation of pals, we have to answer the question on everyone's minds first. How many people is Mr. Mizobe hiring? I thought he didn't have any publishers funding the game. Well, he didn't. The game was being completely self-funded because of the sales of the previous game, Craftopia. Look at this footage from the game just a few months after moving to Unreal Engine 4. Then look at the same footage of the game a year after development. Did you see any big differences? Well, you can shoot and capture enemies, but that was about it. Mr. Mizobe had realized how big of a game this was and that they needed to hire a lot more people to help with the process. They would need the 3D animator, Mr. Adachi, a character artist, a modeler, and many more people for their ambitious title. So he did what anyone would do in that occasion. He just ignored all his finances. This is not financial advice. He says, "What's the maximum budget?" The most obvious upper limit would be the limit at which the company would go bankrupt. So he kept hiring until the company almost went bankrupt, and he ended up hiring over 40 additional people, along with outsourcing for other smaller tasks. Somehow they managed to finish the game right on time before all the company's money was gone. He said, "It is not known how much money it cost. I don't even want to see it." He estimated the total cost was about 1 billion yen, which is about $6 million US. Now, at the launch of the game, there was a lot of controversy about how the designs of the pals looked very similar to Pokemon, some people calling it a ripoff. But even if they did take heavy inspiration, there's no denying that the pals were designed to be fun, colorful, playful, and cute. So far, we've mentioned the expert in shooting animations, which helps bring the guns to life in the game, Mr. Adachi, who saved the project with his great 3D animations, and Mr. Matsutani, who gathered all the engineers and helped organize the project. But who was the one who designed the actual pals? Well, actually, the face of Palworld was rejected when they first applied to the company in October 2020. They were a new graduate and had a lot of ability, but the designs they had submitted didn't really fit into the style of Palworld. But in February 2021, Palworld was again hiring for new artists, and the same person decided to apply again. Mr. Mizobe decided to take a chance on them. And if you notice, there's a common theme here where Mr. Mizobe is constantly taking on new chances and risks and hoping it will turn out for the better. And this one paid off big time. Mr. Mizobe quickly realized that this person had a great talent. He said, "They are incredibly fast at drawing. It's the fastest I've ever seen. They were also able to change any feedback instantly. They knew English, and they were great at art most of all." And it's funny because this person had been rejected by 100 companies before finally being accepted by Mr. Mizobe. And because of them, they were able to create the dozens of pals that we see in the game today. All of these miracles paved the way for Palworld, which is the biggest miracle of all. A grand idea with little to no planning, a patchwork team, no budget management at all, and it was released on Steam on early access only a few years after the start of its development. But Palworld stands out among the sea of IP-driven games and proven genres, providing a refreshing take on how games are supposed to be, challenging conventions, and focusing on fun above all. If you incorporate a reliable game system with good graphics and proven fun, that alone will be enough to sell commercially, Mr. Mizobe says. The game combines elements of open-world crafting games like Ark Survival Evolved and Minecraft, but introduces elements of base building, automation, taming, and capturing. They also differ in their stylized graphic looks of the pals with a realistic environment. They didn't really focus on the story of the game and just decided to gear it towards creating meaningful social experiences between the players. There were many others who were instrumental to the making of the game, but it just goes to show how someone with a strong dream and passion and the nerve to not give up can come together against all odds and make something that's really magical. In the words of Mr. Mizobe, we hold our fate in our own hands. And don't forget to subscribe and like if you enjoyed this video, and check out my previous ones. They're pretty cool.